Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. This episode is brought to you by Wondrium, which brings you thousands of hours of audio and video courses, documentaries, tutorials, and much more. As you know, because I talk about this all the time, I love audio content to listen to while I'm driving and cycling and doing chores and walking with the dog and so on, and Wondrium is my go-to place to get that. Whether or not they were advertising on this show, I use the product because it's great. So here's the deal. You subscribe to the system, and then you get unlimited access to all those thousands of hours. I'll give you an example. Here's a course I listened to on a trip I just took to Germany with my wife for 2 weeks. So I listened to this entire course when I was traveling alone in this particular case. And so, you spend just tons of time driving to the airport and standing in lines and going through customs and baggage claim, and sitting on the plane and in between movies and so on. I took this course called Crimes of the Century, A Selective History of Infamy. Oh man, this is great. This is worth the cost of subscription by itself. Just this one course. It was really good. It's 12 lectures. Let's see. Just some of the ones you will have heard about. The Sarajevo Conspiracy of 1914. I wrote about that in my conspiracy book that triggered the First World War. The plot to assassinate the Romanovs. Really interesting. 3 serial killers of Weimar Germany. The American Nightmare. The Lindbergh kidnapping. There was stuff in there I did not know about. Of course, I know about that kidnapping, but the Papin Sisters of France. The Moscow to Mexico mission to kill Trotsky. Leon Trotsky was murdered ordered the murder by Stalin. California's Zodiac Killer. We still don't have the Zodiac Killer. So this guy brings you all the details about that. The Charles Manson crime family. There's new twists in this. Really interesting character and weird things about this. How he got off his parole time and time again before the Tate LaBianca murders. He should never have been free. And so something was really weird there. Son of Sam, of course, that was the New York serial killer. And Italy's search for the monster of Florence. Anyway, super interesting course. Check it out. So here's the deal. If you subscribe to Wondrium through the podcast, you get a free year. You subscribe for 1 year and you get the second year free. 2 years for the cost of one. Why would you not do this? So check it out. Go to wondrium.com/Shermer. That's Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, SHERMER, as you know. Wondrium.com/Shermer, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, and get 2 years of subscription for the price of one. What are you waiting for? Go do that and then come back to listen to this episode. All right, here we go. I usually ask my guests for a little bit of background about themselves, yours in particular. How did you end up in South Africa studying sex workers, from where you came from and what you studied?
Sure. So I first went to South Africa while I was still a student, and we did this 2-week human rights trip to South Africa to study gender equality in light of the new constitution. And during the course of this trip, I knew I wanted to return. We visited the Constitutional Court. It was just an amazing institution. And, there was this open embrace of human rights norms. And I wondered what it looked like when a country openly embraces human rights within its domestic system. So the real question was, how would I get back to South Africa? Because I knew I wanted to go back. 2 weeks just wasn't enough. And so I ended up getting a clerkship with the Constitutional Court, and I was there for 6 months and clerked for Justice van der Westhuizen. And by the way, I'm really impressed with your pronunciation of his name. And so,
Thank you.
I worked with him, and, while I was there, I was, having a growing interest in policing issues in particular, and just wanted to think about, what are ways for me to study the police, but be able to do it in a way that's a little bit different from the way that other police and scholars were doing it. And I just learned about this growing issue around how sex workers were being policed, and decided that I would focus on that issue, and went back to South Africa and did additional research on that.
Yeah, interesting. So I noticed that you had a discussion of the use of language, like prostitution as a word is pretty loaded with moral baggage. So sex work is the preferred term, I guess. And that seems right to me because, so let me just give you my kind of libertarian take on sex work. What do I care? And it's none of my business what two consenting adults do in the privacy of a bedroom. Why do we care about this? Why is it illegal anywhere? What's with the obsession about people having sex? Now, I'm not talking about underage people or pedophiles, anything like that. Just consenting adults exchanging money for sex. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, I am really sympathetic to that position. I think, what the concern that some people have is that, if anyone makes that choice, well, then it's not a real choice. And, there's some, especially, a lot of feminists who argue that, no one could really consent to that and therefore it should be criminalized. And I really disagree with that approach. As you mentioned, you have two consenting individuals who are, entering into this transaction with each other. But even if you don't agree with that, even if you think that, that person, one of them couldn't have really consented to it, you're only bringing more harm when you devote so many resources to policing and prosecuting them as opposed to, actually supporting them and, really recognizing the harms that come with I'm just focusing on policing, right? I just don't think that's the right approach when you're dealing with this issue. If you are really concerned with the people who are engaging in sex work, and so any angle that you come at it from, I just don't see how policing and criminalization actually works.
Right. The pushback I usually get to that is, well, but it is harmful to women. They're mistreated, they're abused. The men that are involved in the sex trade are abusive and they're on drugs and, and a lot of the Johns are abusive and so on. Well, but wouldn't that all be corrected if it was legal and regulated like any other trade or business? And the reason you have those abuses is because it's illegal, just like the drug trade. The reason there's so much corruption in the exchange of money for drugs is because the drugs are illegal, right? So, and people want them. So there's going to be a black market if there's not a free market. And there you go.
hmm I think that's right. This is one of the harms that come when you have these secondary markets, right? It's not that you're actually going to eliminate what you're trying to eliminate. You just make it more dangerous for people who are engaging in that trade. And so, with sex workers, when it's criminalized, what you find is that they're not able to actually communicate with each other about different potential clients. They're not able to actually screen clients because they're also hiding from policing, hiding from criminalization. So it just ends up making it more dangerous. And I don't know of any society ever in time that has been successful at completely eradicating prostitution. So it's a fool's errand, right? And I think focusing on how to make it safer would actually be a better approach.
Yeah. So how do you go about studying it? So let's talk about your methodology. You just call up the police and say, "Hey, I'd like to come on some patrols and check out the the nightlife in Johannesburg."
Yeah, it was interesting. So it was a legal ethnography. And so what that means, one of the main modes that I used for gathering data was participant observation. So joining the police on their patrols, interviewing police, joining sex workers in, hotspots where they're working, interviewing sex workers. And the way that I got access to the police, I think it took me a good year. I submitted a research request to the National Police Department. They had a research office, and they stalled and tried to prevent me from doing the research over a course of months. And I was just pretty persistent. Eventually, I got the approval, but it did take quite some time for me to get that approval.
Yeah, I like the your passage here about the officers that you join in the patrol car. Some officers worried that I would place myself in danger. They would frequently put on a performance to assert their masculinity, such as bragging about the danger of the job or displaying their firearms for me. This is such a guy thing. There was a constant
Yeah.
performance of black urban male masculinity in the form of bravado and displays of physical strength. In addition, some officers viewed me as a woman who needed protection, and they provided unsolicited guidance during the course of my research project. Here, darling, let me help you there. Oh my
Yes,
God. It's
yes.
so funny.
Yeah, no, it was interesting when I first went there. I remember, at first they were like, you're not going to find anything. There's nothing to find besides, you're coming. This is really dangerous. Let me show you how dangerous this is. And I remember one person, one of the officers telling me, how dangerous it was, and was like kind of showing off his gun as he was, going through this whole thing. And I was like, well, I have some sense. I'm a researcher. I think there's some things here, to uncover. And they were just concerned about other things, and I guess protecting me from harm's way. So it was interesting. So it took some time even for me to kind of develop trust and build a relationship with the officers. But one of the benefits of participant observation is that it happens over time, and so there's only for so long that people can put up a front. Eventually people's true colors come in. You spend enough time with someone, you become friends with them, and you develop relationships.
Hmm. Yeah, you're right that the problem of basically what you're doing and their problem of policing it is that, quote, the police must respect the human rights of sex workers, but they must also enforce the laws of the country. Sex work is illegal, but it is also time consuming to regulate and difficult to prove that a sex work transaction occurred. Sex work involves activity that occurs in private transactions in spaces that are ordinarily private, but the illegality of sex work makes it a matter of public concern. Okay, so what is their job when you're driving around? What are they looking for? Like, oh, we think a transaction just happened there on the street corner and they went up the stairs to the hotel room or whatever it is.
Mhm. So it depended on the location. So for areas where it was street based, some of it was just looking for drivers who might be slowly driving around in the area, or maybe if they saw a sex worker enter someone's car. Some of it is anticipatory, right? They didn't really see much of anything, and it's just asking people questions who I think might be. And then, I'd imagine they got it wrong sometimes, but maybe just the threat of being accused was enough for some people to acquiesce to whatever the
Mm,
officer might have been asking for. And so, they never actually observed, an actual sex work transaction, but a lot of it was just, kind of speculating or guessing what might have occurred and using intimidation to get
mm,
people at times to admit to it.
to try to get a confession, you mean, and then they have the law being broken and they could arrest somebody.
Yes. So, one thing that they would often say is, well, we know you're from this area and your family, you have a family, and we're just going to drive you home to your wife. Or you might give us a bribe. Or you might, you know, or you might, we'll just take you to the station and we'll call your wife from there. Right. And so, someone's in that situation, let's say they weren't really doing anything, but just I think the threat of that could be enough for people to do whatever an officer says. You're very vulnerable in that situation. And so that was like the main tactic that they would use to get either a confession or get some sort of bribe from people.
Mm, right, because the guy, even if he didn't do anything, if the police call his wife, she's going to want to know, what were you doing down there at that, because she's going to know what he was trying to do. So obviously that's going to be a problem for him. And so was there a difference between the Johns that were arrested or the sex workers themselves? Is there discrimination there? How do the police decide who they're going to charge?
Mm. So they tended to focus on the clients more during my time there. Although before I was there, I heard that they had arrested a lot of the sex workers. In terms of whether there was a difference, there were actually a difference uh, between the sex workers at different locations. So, as one might suspect, there were more like, high end sex workers in certain locations that might have more protection and security. And then in other locations, particularly street-based locations, maybe that were more crowded, then there would be what would be considered lower end sex workers who were charging a lower amount. And actually, the ways that the officers interacted with those sex workers was actually pretty violent. There was one time when they went there and they were speaking about how dirty and unhygienic they are and all these sorts of like epithets that they were throwing at them. Whereas, I heard the officers speak about sex workers at, higher end locations with reverence and I guess even some appreciation and acknowledgement that these were professionals. So that was interesting to see the difference there. And with the different locations, the clients were different, right? And so higher end location, there was this one kind of like hotel brothel location where you see a bunch of like Mercedes Benzes, luxury vehicles parked outside of that location. Is very secure, and it had all these amenities attached. It was more like a strip club in one area, and then there was the brothel in the back. Whereas, for the other locations, maybe it's, more middle income and then lower income clients.
I think you mentioned in your book that sometimes the police themselves the bribe would be sex with one of the sex workers, and then we won't turn you in, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So there were, a number of sex workers who mentioned to me, in the past, they had interacted with police who had tried to solicit, sex. And, from the sex workers' perspectives, at least the ones I spoke to, they didn't have an issue with having police clients. In fact, several of them liked that. That way they could call the officers for protection. The real issue was if an officer was trying to get some sort of discount or not pay the normal fee. And there were some situations where that would occur, where someone was arrested, and that was the threat that they heard. By the time I started doing research, that had stopped in large part, but it was still something that had happened at some point.
Right. So, what are the statistics on who works in the sex work industry? Who are the customers? It's like 99% women as sex workers and 99% men that solicit them, right? Is that right? I don't really know the statistics on it.
Statistics with sex work are notoriously difficult. Like, so the kind of like demographic type of study of like the numbers of people who are engaged in sex work, especially now, right? Because so much of it, previously you could maybe have certain areas in many cities around the world where you might have a red light district, and that's kind of the place where people went for like sex work, and maybe you'd have some escorts over the phone. But now a lot of it has moved to online spaces, right, where you don't even necessarily see it, right, and it can be hard to kind of track and get a sense of do like a census of everyone who's engaged in it, because people are just using online ads these days, and not even bothering with street, because you can screen your clients. It's more convenient. Everyone has apps. Oh, excuse me. Everyone has access to cellular phones, and so it's just a lot more convenient. So I can't cite any like specific statistics about like what the number of sex workers is. However, from my observations in South Africa, most of the sex workers I observed were female sex workers. There were some transgender sex workers that I observed as well. Transgender women sex workers I observed. And, I also was aware that there were also, gay sex workers who worked in different locations. And so I went to locations where it was mostly women sex workers. In terms of the clients were also mostly male clients. However, sex workers told me that they had some female clients as well.
Right. Since you work at the Kinsey Institute that does a lot of scientific research on human sexuality, which was an eye opener starting in the 1950s. I mean, that really changed the way we think about things. And since this is a science program, I should remind our listeners, Alfred Kinsey was an entomologist. He studied wasps, and he noticed even with a fairly homogeneous species like wasp, there was considerable variation. So how much more variation there must be in human action and behavior? And sure enough, certainly with sexuality, it was way more varied than anybody thought. And yet, but why is it that it's mostly men soliciting sex and it's mostly women working in the sex trade? Are there discussions or research at the Kinsey Institute on why there is such an asymmetry there?
It's not something that's a focus of the institute right now, but it's something that I've actually been thinking about. So it might be a project that I do while at the institute. I think there are a couple of theories about why that might occur. So one dominant one that we mentioned a little bit earlier. There's some feminists who say because there's patriarchy and men have domination over women's bodies. That's why we have the sale of sex and men mostly purchasing. And so that is the illustration of men mostly purchasing. And that's why we need to criminalize it, right? And so that's one theory. But there are other possibilities, right? It could just be that, women are socialized not to really embrace their sexuality in that way, right? And so, when a woman is, very sexual, that's kind of, looked down upon. People are, there's the whole idea of people being like slut shamed, and men are socialized differently, right? And so, maybe women are just less willing to, purchase sex. It could just be partially that. So, there's a lot of potential reasons for it. Another reason, there's, and this is something that I think would be interesting to study as well, is like the percentage of sex work transactions that actually result in sex. There's assumption that it's mostly about the sex. But from my experiences speaking with sex workers, most of their clients aren't having sex with them, which is really interesting and not something that people really discuss. Yeah. So a lot of it is about conversation. A lot of it is people who are just lonely, which I think is really interesting, And so, I think, kind of examining that as well would be kind of interesting and kind of undermine some of the assumptions about, why people purchase sex, right? Or why people would, purchase the services of a sex worker.
Right. That's interesting. So it's not all just guys that are married and haven't had sex at home in years, so they're going to these women for sex. No, there's some other reason. They're lonely. They want somebody to talk to. Yeah, that's really interesting. I've heard that about phone, whatever you call that, phone sex work or whatever. It's mostly they just want to talk, somebody to talk to. Back in the 90s when we investigated the psychic friends network and all the telephone psychics, it was mostly, and I got to know one of them pretty well. It was mostly lonely people on the weekends looking to talk to somebody. And it didn't really have anything to do with psychic power or anything like that. It was just, I want to talk about love, health, money, career, just, somebody to talk to, which is what friends are for, right? And maybe not everybody has friends. So yeah, that's interesting. So that, and the women do it because obviously money, right? It's a job.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the primary motivator, money. And then, even just the different opportunities available to them, right? Again, come back to money, but the fact that for pretty much most of them, if not all of them, this work provided the highest income that would be available to them for the same amount of time, right? And so, a lot of them saw it as an opportunity. There were people who used it to pay their education, or for, a lot of women I interacted with who were supporting extended families, right? So not just, themselves and their children, but also, maybe their brother, their mother, and other people in their family. And this allowed them to do that.
So do you see it as like the women you dealt with? Was it kind of a, in economics, they have this rational choice theory, that people are making kind of utilitarian calculus decisions in their lives. And this is just one more. I could work at McDonald's flipping burgers, or I could do this. This pays 10 times more. I'm going to do that. And so they make choices like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what I observed, especially in the context of South Africa. None of the people that I spoke with had been forced into sex work. They were all working independently, right? So there's often this concern that maybe someone is being pimped. And I think in some ways that's just part of the mythology around prostitution. It's not the reality of it. So they were all working independently. They all started as adults. So there was no one that I interacted with who started as a child. And it was just people trying to, provide for themselves, provide for their families. And, as you mentioned, given the choices available to them, make the choice that they thought was most rational for them and their lives.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Did any of them have, I don't know how to ask that. I don't want to say, did they enjoy it, but did they at least make the best of it? Like, well, this guy seemed nice and I talked to him for a while and that was fun. So it's, you want your job to be enjoyable, not just for the money, right? Were they able to carve out some sort of niche of, or like, okay, this is actually, I'm gaining something from this, or there's some value to it?
hmm Yeah. So, for some of them, they saw it as like, this is a performance. I'm going in my job and I'm acting, and that's, kind of what I do. And then it was interesting, like, as I got to know some of them better, some of them did admit to the fact that they did get some enjoyment from it, in the sense that one woman in particular told me how, she quit for a while and was doing domestic work, and the thing that she most about it wasn't the money, it was the intimacy and having those connections with people. And she was just like not used to that. Like she was used to, always interacting and having this connection and, just even a sexual connection with someone. And, she didn't expect to miss it because, women aren't taught that that's okay for them to miss that in that type of way. And, I thought it was really interesting that, that was the thing that she missed most, although, she was doing it for the money. That was her primary concern when she entered, but that was the thing that she missed most when she left.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder how much of it is kind of throwback to archaic ideas in science and culture that women do not enjoy sex. I mean, going back to like the 19th century or even well into the 20th century before Kinsey pioneered that women can't have orgasms, or if they do, they're not real orgasms, or they don't have adaptive purposes like a men's orgasm. And what's the purpose of the clitoris? Well, it's sort of a byproduct. The main thing is the penis, right? And the clitoris is just like a little mini penis, right? Right. There was no autonomy for women until really just recently, very very much post Kinsey, who kind of broke that ice, right? And also women just as passive receptors, not actively engaged in the sexual act itself and getting their own autonomy and pleasure out of it.
hmm I think that's right. That's absolutely right. Right. And so, it's not really, I think, since until like more movements that focus on like sex positivity, do you have more women kind of just openly embracing just being sexual individuals. And so, there's some challenges that come with that.
Yeah. I don't know if you read Cindy Meston and David Buss's book, Why Women Have Sex. It's an eye opener. I had no idea there were so many motives, right? Because I'm just a guy. And yeah, boredom or just needed some stimulation or pity sex, right? Or, love and connection or, whatever. It's revenge. It's like, oh, wow. Okay. And that book is like into the 2000s before it's like, why? Before anybody even asked why women have sex. I mean, that's such a weird title. Like it took it till the 21st century to ask that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. It's remarkable. As you mentioned, there were all these assumptions about, you know, women not really being sexual beings, and even, when you think about, the history of prostitution in particular, there was the idea, that you have, the mothers and the wives, and they needed to remain pure and right and take care of the children, and then you can have sex workers, right, and that's where men were free to, really live out their sexual desire. And so you see that in like Victorian England, you see that really throughout the world. And so it's just really interesting that there has always been this perception to be, a proper woman, that you don't necessarily have a real like sexual desire or a real sex drive. And the women who do are, more like the outcasts.
Hmm. Did any of the women you engaged with talk about like role playing, that the guys wanted to dress up like, I don't know what, a nurse or a teacher or something or anything like that as well, not just straight vanilla sex?
No, I none of them spoke to me about any of that, honestly. Like I don't think any of them spoke to me about that. I think, more of it was creating perhaps a bit of like a girlfriend experience, right? So like the full intimacy, right? So it could be going out, doing things together, like ordinary things, maybe cooking together, and then there could be sex at the end of the night, but like a real experience, like this is your girlfriend. And so I think that was something that was pretty common.
Oh yeah, of course, right. So it's not just go up to the hotel room. No, you go out for the evening and do something like a
Mm-hmm.
date.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes more sense then for the motives for both people. Yeah. I found on this site, National Center for Transgender Equality, they did a survey since you mentioned trans, and this is a hot subject in culture today. But according to the survey, 40% of Black trans women and 13% of all trans women participated in sex work. Why is this rate so elevated? And I presume these are trans women, I guess, but I guess it could go the other way if it was homosexual man. It gets a little confusing. According to this meta
Mm.
analysis, another study that they published, as many as 21.6% of trans women in high income countries are infected with HIV, and so on. So, why is that? Any idea on that?
I'm not sure. I honestly not sure why. Um, you find a high rate of women, transgender people, and queer people who are engaged in sex work. I guess one possibility is that maybe there are less opportunities for them in a labor market. Maybe they face other forms of discrimination, and then they go to sex work. So that's one possibility. But I'm not sure whether there's a real clear, definitive answer to that.
Right. Are you familiar with Alan Fiske's, the anthropologist Alan Fiske's four relational models theory about human interactions? Let me just kind of run through it here because I think it gets to the heart of why people are uncomfortable with sex work. So his four relations are communal sharing, like relatives, couples, marriage, partners, families, friends. Authority ranking, like an employer, employee, teacher, student, parent, child. Equality matching, like friends that split gas, informal exchanges, roommates sharing chores around the apartment, and so forth. And then number four, market pricing, the economy of strangers. Money is the social currency of exchange and reciprocity. Anyway, Fisk, like he uses examples, like for example, if you were invited over to somebody's house for dinner and you offered to pay them, that would be a kind of a violation of a relational model. Like, what do you mean pay you? We're doing this because we're friends, right? And you should invite me over to your house and not charge me, right? Or if you went to a restaurant and had a dinner and instead of paying, you offered the owner to come to your house for dinner, it'd be like, what? And so Fisk and others use these models to kind of, or like the Woody Allen bit where he talks about his watch. He said, my grandfather on his deathbed sold me his watch. It's like, what? You don't pay for your grandfather's watch. Yeah. Right. So they use this for like, what's the resistance to organ donations? Like somebody has two kidneys, they want to sell a kidney. Somebody needs a kidney. Why not have a kidney free market? Right. And it can be regulated and controlled and, and because there's not enough organ donations for people to need them. This is a market solution. Right. But there's so much resistance because it just feels wrong to pay for a human organ. And I think that maybe that's the way a lot of people feel about sex. It's the kind of thing you do freely, exchange with another person to develop a relationship or intimacy or whatever, but you don't pay for it. It's something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's one of the common critiques of sex work, that you're selling your body, and no one should support the commodification of the body. I think what a lot of sex workers say, though, they're not actually selling their bodies. They have their bodies when they leave. They're selling a service, right? They're selling a sexual service. And, much in the same way where we might see two boxers perform in Las Vegas, make a lot of money after their body has been really physically mutilated in some ways for our own entertainment, but we permit that. Perhaps we should allow two people who enter into a private space and exchange, acts with each other to do so. And so, it's I think it's different from an organ donation, because with the organ donation, you literally are selling part of your body, so it could be distinguished pretty easily from it.
Yeah, I thought of that when I was reading this passage from your book. Conservatives argue that sex work is an affront to the traditional nuclear family, sanctions non procreative sex. It happens outside of the marital relationship. Sex work commercializes sex. It presumably destroys marital relationships and infects spouses with venereal disease that has been harvested in the sex worker's body. The radical progressive position is concerned with systemic reform and rejects theories of citizenship that overemphasizes the individual. It is concerned with protecting vulnerable classes from the systematic oppression of a racist, heterosexist, male, hegemonic patriarchy. Okay, deconstruct that for us. For those of us not steeped in postmodern language,
Sure.
what does that mean?
Yeah, so I think
Not the
maybe a
conservative part.
conservative.
We know why conservatives are.
Yeah. So for radical, or for like some progressive people who oppose sex work, their concern is that, if we care about women, sex work is just categorically problematic for women. We're allowing the sale of women, and we need to stop that. We're in this system that is oppressive for women. We're allowing men to purchase women, and that's the reason we need to stop sex work, right? And so that's the argument that some progressives make about why we shouldn't allow sex work. And the fact that, we have individual liberties and rights, well, that's less of a concern for them, that there's an overemphasis on the individual. And instead, we should focus on like the broad category of people, like how womankind as this, kind of singular abstract thing is impacted by Sally selling sex in, Nevada.
Mm, right. So, yeah, that's interesting. For what's the right thing to advance rights for women? So, this would be like pornography is an abuse of objectification of a woman's body, right? So, and consumed by men. So, it's part of the patriarchy. So, therefore, it should be outlawed or restricted. That would be the kind of radical feminist, or more of the progressive side argument.
Yeah, in essence, yes. Right. So the fact that we have pornography is the objectification of women, and therefore it should be eliminated or criminalized.
Hmm.
That would be their
But,
argument.
well, I don't know. How do you feel about that? Yeah.
I don't agree. I don't agree. I don't think
Why?
there's a singular womankind who is, categorically harmed by commercialized sex. It's interesting because I think in some ways, that position kind of reveals kind of traditional ways of thinking about sex, and it makes the assumption that women primarily experience sex as an oppressive thing, and some of them say it, right? And I don't think it really allows for space for women to actually have a different form of sexuality, to actually enjoy sex, who want to use it in different types of ways. It just assumes all women are harmed as a general matter from sex acts, and it always assumes that everyone who's engaging in sex work is a woman, right? That was one of the primary arguments,
Hmm.
and one of the critiques is that it doesn't count for queer people. Like, how does gay porn harm women, right? Why do we eliminate porn? And there's no good answer to that. Um, and so, a lot of the assumptions that underlie those types of arguments, I think, they reveal how weak the argument is.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were going to pursue research on that question of why is it mostly men consuming sex work and pornography, I think the evolutionary psych argument is pretty good, that there's a gender or sex difference between how many partners men versus women want, how choosy or selective or risk averse are men versus women, and so on. And the differences are pretty striking, at least the research that I've seen, like on dating sites. And now there's like millions of people on these sites, so they have huge data sets. If you ask women, what percentage of the men that you look at, their profiles, would you go out with? And it's like 4.5%. Men, it's like 97%. It's like, and if you ask women, how many dates would you need to go on before you'd be intimate with somebody? It's like, I think the average was 7. And for men, it was like, is there a number below 1? Can we just go now? It's like, what? And, those sorts of things. And how many partners have you had? Of course, it's self-report data, so who knows how accurate it is. But, how many partners have you had? How many partners would you like to have in a lifetime or the next decade or whatever? And it's like an order of magnitude difference between men and women. Now, they have theories about this that have been contested by feminist scholars that have to do with how risky sex is for women versus men, and the reproductive strategies to get your genes to the next generation. Men can just be more promiscuous. Not that some women aren't, but on average, that kind of difference. Anyway, that's their kind of take on it. I've never seen an evolutionary psychoanalysis of prostitution or pornography, because that's not what I do. But I think it's something along those lines of why there's such a striking difference between men and women on that front.
Yeah, it could be. What's interesting about pornography actually is that women's pornography consumption isn't that off from men. And it's been increasing actually quite a bit. One of the
Oh, really?
Yeah, the most searched term for pornography, at least I think it was from like a couple years ago on Pornhub, was pornography for women. Which is interesting, right?
Really?
And
All right.
kind of illustrates the way that some of the norms are changing. But I think with Pornhub, I think they reported it was somewhere like around 40% or so are women who were consuming pornography, which is just really interesting in terms of some of our expectations about like who's consuming and who's not. And so with pornography in particular, I think there's some interesting changes occurring. And it could be, why there's a difference between pornography and sex work. It could be like with pornography, then maybe women are better able to conceal it. And so there isn't this, fear that maybe you'll be outed or, be revealed in some way. So that's a really interesting thing. But it's with the dating sites, it's funny because men are less selective in terms of, how many people they'll, swipe and positive for. But women have infinitely more choices, right? And so they have the luxury of being able to
That's right.
be really selective, right? And so, maybe a man might have, just like a handful of people who are liking their page, whereas with, women who would ordinarily seem to be, comparable to that same man might have like hundreds, and so they have the luxury to be selective about who they choose, which is also kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's right. I had a female anthropologist tell me when I asked her that question. She said, "Why don't women go to prostitutes at the same rate as men?" Is because they don't have to. All they have to do is say "you," and they have their selection of 100 guys. Okay. Whereas guys, it's a little different market for guys. Anyway, yeah. So that is so interesting, right? Okay, so let's seg into talking about the trans movement. That's a pretty huge topic now. We just seen about the trans athletes thing has been in the news yesterday, about the trans swimming and all that. But with the larger picture, I just had Helen Joyce on the show. I haven't released this yet. Her book is called Trans, and I had Abigail Schreier on. Abigail's pretty conservative. Helen Joyce is pretty liberal, actually. She was a mathematician and writer for The Economist. But there's this huge spike, like 4,000% increase in self-identified trans in the UK, and it's like a 2,200% increase in the United States. So the question is why is that? Is it that society's become more liberal and accepting, and so people are coming out that couldn't have come out before, much like the gay community? Or is it that it's more of a social contagion? And so those are the kind of two competing hypotheses. I have no idea if you've given much thought to this or research on that, or if your Kinsey Institute colleagues are working on that, or or what?
Yeah, this is outside my research area. So any thoughts I have about this are mostly just kind of speculation or, what I personally think based off of just my own beliefs. But I mean, I'm convinced by the theory that it could be because, people feel more open or more welcome to come out. And, you see older people who are also, um, coming out more as being transgender. And so, I think we live in a different kind of social environment where maybe people don't feel like they need to kind of conceal their true identities. And so those are my personal thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what the Kinsey Institute comes up. This is so rapidly changing. I mean, the data is just pouring in by the week. There's so much we don't know. Same thing like with the pornography thing. It's the accessibility of free, endless pornography online in the privacy of your home is pretty new, right? That's less than 20 years, maybe 15 years, right? And so, I mean, it could be that women will catch up, as you said, because before you had to go, I don't know where, you had to go to these dark houses, downtown cities, and women aren't going to do that, and it's pretty risk averse to do that. I mean, it's pretty risky to do that at all. Or you have to go to a video store in the back room to get the VHS tapes or whatever. I mean, yeah, it's just so that could also change in the coming decades. All right, let me ask you about critical race theory, the third hot topic in culture these days. And so maybe you could give us, because you do work in this space, just kind of give us a little tutorial. What is critical race theory? Most people have heard, somebody like Trump talking about it, or Chris Rufo, or some of these kind of more popular public intellectuals that are railing against it. And then you have people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo on the other side. But in fact, as some of us know, anyway, it goes back to the 1970s. It was a legal theory and so on. So kind of walk us through what are the central tenets about critical race theory.
Sure. So critical race theory is a legal theory, right? So it's coming out of legal institutions from law schools with law professors predominantly about how to look at the law, right? And how the law was operating. And so, as you mentioned, it really started to develop the late 1970s, 1980s, where a group of scholars got together and spoke about the law and race and how the law was interacting with race. And critical race theorists are actually a pretty diverse group. Even the early scholars who helped form the movement. And I could give you some definitions, and people will disagree about the definitions. But I think one of the central ideas is that the ways that racism shows up in American society, that actually it's not unusual. That is actually something that has been a feature of the ways that's operated, right? And so, an obvious example is the fact that, we had a Supreme Court case that, found that, slavery was compatible with the US Constitution. So that's just one example of the law operating in such a way to permit racism, right? And so another, common one could be the way that the law operated to um, allow for Jim Crow laws, right? And so there was, the law operating such a way to facilitate racism. So that's one, central idea around critical race theory. Maybe it's like the core idea. And so kind of examining all the different ways that comes up. And another idea is that, race as a category is socially constructed. And so what that means is that it's not just some biological thing that, in even American history, the ways that we've defined race has shifted over time. And so there is a point where it's like, if you have a grandparent that's black, that means, a grandparent that's black, but you have three grandparents who are white, well, you're going to be considered, to be a black person. There are other times where actually you just needed one great grandparent, and then you're considered a black person. And then you have in some states the definition change again to be, you have a drop of black blood, then you're a black person, right? Or another example could be, even how Mexican identity was constructed. So, there was a time in like around Texas where Mexican people were at times considered to be Mexican, and that was its own racial category. And there was another times when they were considered to be white. And so, and they had to, identify as being white. And so, that's another feature of critical race theory is, the ways that we define race aren't just natural. There actually been choices made at different points, and those definitions have shifted over time. And so, bringing it to the current conversations about, critical race theory, what people, people like Trump or Chris Rufo are speaking about critical race theory, they're not speaking about critical race theory because critical race theory is something that's discussed in law schools, right? So it's not like a conversation that's really happening, in popular media, at least not until they helped it happen in popular media. And, it's a framework that's really been focused on thinking about the law. Now, Ibram Kendi and like Robin DiAngelo, they don't even identify, or at least they didn't at a certain point, necessarily identify as being critical race theorists, although they are, talking about race and, the history of racism in this country. But I don't know for sure that they would even be critical race theorists. But, what Trump and Chris Rufo are doing is, taking this concept, this theoretical framework, and trying to kind of misidentify it and conflate it with any conversation that has anything to do with race and say, oh, that's critical race theory and we should be afraid of critical race theory, when in fact, what they're saying is that when people are having conversations about race in this country, this is something that we need to be afraid of, which doesn't make sense, because I think most Americans are smart and capable and can have these difficult conversations and be respectful when we have these conversations. We don't need to name everything as critical race theory to be afraid of.
Yeah. Yeah. Labels tend to get truncated, shortened, and then bifurcated into black and white choices. I agree. That's a problem. I'm not sure what they're talking about when they think they're talking about critical race theory. Maybe it's anti-racism. I think what bothers people about Kendi, I read Kendi's book, is kind of the circularity, the definition. What is anti-racist, or what is racism? If there's any black-white differences anywhere on anything, that's racism. Well, why are those differences there? Because of racism. It's like we need an exogenous cause from a social scientist perspective. What is the cause of it? Now, it used to be, well, most people were just racist assholes. That's why, in the history of America, that's true, right? But, we've come a long ways. Surveys show, over the last, 3/4 of a century or so, that they've been asking questions like this. Like, would you leave the neighborhood if a black family moved in next door? Or would you be upset if your son or child dated somebody who was a different race? Those sorts of things. And those numbers have just plummeted. I mean, people would be horrified to be even asked that now, I think. And I think pollsters don't even ask those questions anymore. So that kind of overt racism, I think, is large. I wouldn't say it's gone, because there'll always be some racist assholes out there that are going to join the Proud Boys or the KKK or whatever. That's never going to be zero. But, as I like to say, conservatives today are more liberal socially on, say, women's rights, civil rights, maybe even gay rights than liberals were in the 1950s. I mean, we've come a long ways, right? So that's not what you're talking about, though, right? You're talking about systemic, built into the legal system or the banking system or the economic system. Is that right?
That's correct. So, critical race theory focuses on systemic racism, although there's can be focus on there are people who also focus on individual racism too, when they focus on implicit bias, for example. But it's also focused on systemic racism and how the lingering effects of maybe different legal decisions, for example, still exist or still showing their effects.
Yeah. So, I mean, the example you always hear is like redlining in real estate. But hasn't that largely been nipped in the bud? I mean, hasn't the legal system largely gotten rid of that kind of practice?
Yeah, so what's been eliminated might be the redlining, but what hasn't been eliminated maybe the effects of it or the legacy of it, right? And so once you had the
Mm,
redlining, you had these different neighborhoods that were created or really fabricated, right? Because of the redlining that might have like concentrated poverty, right? And so the effects of that actually lasted generations. And even now, it was interesting. I'm not sure if you saw this news story where this Black couple had their house appraised, right? And they decided to they got it appraised themselves where it was clear that it was a Black couple that lived there. You know, they had their family photos or whatever up. And then they decided to appraise it again because they knew it was undervalued and pretended and had like a white family kind of there. And there was a huge difference in terms of how that appraisal came back,
really?
right? And so how do you explain that? How do you explain that? So it could be maybe the implicit biases, that individual biases of that um, appraiser, but it shows and it seems to be showing that it's more of a systemic issue. It could be the ways that the appraisers are looking at Black communities. So it's still again in some ways a lingering effect of redlining or maybe other kind of perceptions around Black neighborhoods and communities, right? And so that was just a really interesting and clear example of the ways that racism still shows up. You had this great house in this middle class kind of community being undervalued, and the only difference was who presented the house. And so I think that was like a really interesting illustration of the bias that's still within the real estate industry.
It would be interesting to see if that could be replicated. That was a little bit like the resumes sent out that had a male sounding name or a female sounding name or a Black sounding name or a white sounding name. They get differential rates of response and hiring. The weird thing about that is that, like, since you work in academia, it's a pretty liberal environment. Most academics want to do the right thing. They want to have a diverse faculty and student body. They want to hire more women and more Blacks and so forth. And so is it that behind closed doors they don't really want to, or is it unconscious, or is it more of a pipeline problem? So the pipeline problem is like in STEM fields, which is what I know about, is that every academic I know in like physics departments, so they want to hire women physicists and Black physicists and so on. They're going out of their way. The problem is there just aren't that many applying. Why? Because the pipeline hasn't filled up yet. Because it takes decades to kind of catch up. We've just kind of been making these changes over the past few decades. It may take half a century before you get, you have to sort of go back to like grammar school, middle school, where you sort of nurture those kind of interest in STEM fields, and then that'll catch up later, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those are reasons why, the academy doesn't necessarily look like how many people in it would like it to look in terms of reflecting what American society looks like. So, I think it could be individuals have biases that, that are contrary to their stated beliefs, right? So there are plenty of, liberal people who might, say that they believe in, you know, anti-racism who might still have racist values. And for me, it's not so clear that the distinction between liberal and conservative is as meaningful as you would think, especially in the academy, in terms of who's going to be more supportive of, candidates of color or women candidates, or who's going to provide the mentoring for them once they're in the academy. I don't know that that distinction is, as meaningful as people would assume. But it could be unconscious bias. It could be also, some of the pipeline issues. It could be just, mentoring people once they're there, right? And I think people have a higher rate of departure, right, for just not feeling supported or feeling mentored, right? Like, and it could also be that the standards um, aren't always, applied equally. So what's interesting, and Richard Delgado has this interesting law review article. So, the work of a critical race theorist when he kind of goes through the hiring practice for a law faculty. And it's very interesting. And it's actually a pretty funny story. And so, they're trying to hire a new candidate. They say they want to hire a diverse candidate from different backgrounds. They bring someone on who has impeccable credentials, clerked for the Supreme Court, but then they were kind of picking away at him. And they say, his job talk that he gave at the school wasn't so perfect. And they're not sure if he's ready. They think he'd be ready in a year or so. But they need to catch, someone who's going to be just perfect, right? And so he ends up not getting the position. Students are really outraged about it. But, someone on the faculty, they still need this slot to fill, knows someone else, right, who they know is a great guy and who's like a family friend. And maybe this person also doesn't have like the perfect credentials, but this person knows the person, right? And they feel comfortable that he will succeed in the academy. And so it's okay if it's a little bit, his credentials are a little bit lower. It's okay because, he has the voucher from this faculty member. And so, the reason I told that long story is that, I think that plays out quite a bit in the legal academy and just the academy broadly, right? It's so much about the relationships, people feeling comfortable with people, you getting like the endorsement for people. And so, what ends up happening is the academy just ends up replicating itself, right? Through your social networks, who and people feel comfortable with, people like them. And so, I think that's also, at play. And whether the academy is, considered to be more liberal or conservative, that doesn't change that really.
Right. I heard I was listening to a podcast episode you did this morning, and where they asked you, it's kind of a false question, but I'll ask it anyway. If America is so still suppressive, how is it you've succeeded? I mean, you're incredibly successful. And is this a difference between an individual versus, on average, group differences?
Yeah, I think that if you have to look at the average differences, people shouldn't have to necessarily be extraordinary in order to succeed in the US, right? So that's like looking at someone like Barack Obama, who was extraordinary, like bright as a child and reading and, obviously just had some natural gifts, right? And went off and was incredibly successful, right? Well, he was just an extraordinary individual. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, all racism for all Black people was eradicated, right? And so I just think that, thinking about a group as a whole and the average is really important when you're trying to assess, whether there's still lingering inequities. I think in any group, you'll find people who will be able to, still thrive despite their challenges that they might experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's evidence that there weren't challenges that they shouldn't have experienced and that, maybe that individual would have gone even further. But this is where they ended up because of some of those inequities, right? And so I think that would apply for me.
Although it's hard to go much further than President of the United States.
Yes,
That's a pretty good. That's not
Maybe
bad.
he would have reached it at 40 instead of 45.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But if you were gonna tell some young African Americans, here's what I did, and this is as a model, like here's the 6 things you could do to, sort of increase the probabilities that you'll get over these hurdles that are still there.
Mm-hmm.
What are
Well,
some of those things?
for me, my advice would probably be pretty boring and the traditional advice. It's focus on school, do well, think about areas where you're passionate about and devote yourself to that passion and do well in those areas. Work hard. The early part of your career, you're probably going to be working a lot and really busy, but it pays off later on. It's just the traditional kind of advice, very boring advice, but it does pay off, you know. And I know sometimes when people are at school, they're really young, they feel maybe they're just nerds and it's not going to pay off, but the nerds win at the end of the day. So just, keep doing the work and you'll be fine.
Yeah, see, I think that's right. Again, these average group differences, from a social science perspective, it can't always be the cause is just racism because there's so many other factors. Nothing in human behavior is explained by one cause. There's always multiple things, right? So, like the family wealth difference or whatever that measure is, it's pretty significant between black and white. And I think in this podcast you mentioned, well, some of these white people have family inheritance and fewer black people have family inheritance. That's probably true. But I think like one of the reasons that Trump was appealing to people is there was a lot of kind of middle class white people who never inherited anything, and they got screwed in the 2008 2009 housing market collapse, and they never recovered. And these liberal elites are telling them everything is great, and it's not great. And they don't have any white privilege. They go, white privilege? What are you talking about? I'm dirt poor, and I can barely survive. And then along comes Trump and says it's those elite libtards telling you this and follow me. And of course that kind of resonated. I think of the many reasons that'll be used to explain Trump's success. That could be one of them, right? So if you have a Bill Gates and a Warren Buffett and their kids are inheriting $1 billion or whatever it is, the average is going to be pulled up, and you have 10,000 white guys in Ohio that don't inherit anything versus the black average. It's going to be different, but it's not necessarily because of racism or even systemic racism. It could just be this kind of asymmetry of the few on the top that do inherit a lot.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that could be a possibility, a possible way of, understanding it.
Let me ask you something else too. What was I gonna? White privilege. I want to ask you about white privilege. Okay, if anybody has white privilege, it's me. I'm a middle-aged white guy living in Santa Barbara, right? I never get pulled over in my Tesla. They never hassle me. But is that a privilege? I mean, that's the way it should be for everybody. Nobody should be pulled over and hassled because of their skin color, right? So it's really not that I have privilege, it's that some people are being screwed over and we need to fix that problem. Who are these cops pulling over black people for driving while black, right? And that's the problem.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that's one way of framing it, as opposed to like focusing on the benefits that someone's getting, maybe thinking about how everyone can be lifted to that kind of, status to also enjoy those same benefits, right? Because I think you're right. No one should be, harassed, and people should all be able to enjoy these same benefits in society. Absolutely. And I don't think, and maybe some people interpret it this way. I don't think, the term white privilege is intended to mean that those benefits should be stripped away. Maybe some people use it that way, or maybe some people interpret it that way. But I think, it's more to kind of highlight that there is a difference in experience. But I agree with you that, everyone should be lifted up to that higher experience.
Yeah. So again, if we want to make moral progress, continue to bend that arc of the moral universe, which I believe in. It's just to continue to chip away at these areas where there are still problems, right? Like, so some people talk about these rates of police killing blacks. It's not as high as most people think it is. But other studies show it's not just being shot; it's being harassed, being thrown up against the car, being handcuffed, being talked to in a disparaging way. Those studies seem pretty solid. Like there still are some issues in the police. Of course, we don't want to defund the police, but maybe we do need still some reform. Even though I'm sure police today are far more liberal and progressive than they were in the 1950s, but maybe we still have a ways to go.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that there are obviously still issues that need to be addressed that are lingering, and you need to be willing to kind of confront them. Absolutely. I mean, that the evidence is there, as you mentioned. So there's really no disputing that.
Yeah. Let me give an example of, and this isn't critical race theory. I don't know what it is, maybe anti-racism or something, but I'm on the board of this organization called FAIR, foundation against intolerance and racism, right? So they're kind of pushing back against the Ibram X. Kendi type anti-racism programs where, like, school classrooms are divided between the black kids and the white kids, and they sort of try to teach this idea, this is what it feels like, and so on. Anyway, there's this lawsuit they're involved in with this guy. I'll just read you the details of this. Kevin Ray works as a teaching artist for New 42, a publicly funded performing arts organization in New York City, where he delivers art workshops to students across the city. Beginning in 2019, the work environment at New 42 became permeated with insults, stereotypes, and discrimination based on skin color, all under the guise of anti-racism. The discrimination was pervasive and aggressive, so he filed suit against them, and he kept all their emails and so on. His examples are, now I haven't fact-checked these, but I'm just going by the lawsuit here. Segregating employees by skin color for workplace meetings and diversity training sessions. Distributing materials filled with demeaning stereotypes, including that white behavior is characterized by not listening or denial or defensiveness or lack of inquiry, either or binary thinking, and not owning one's white group identity. Accusing the white group of replicating the worst facets of dominant culture, claiming that whiteness divides each and all of us from the earth, the sun, the wind, the water, the stars, etc. Berating white people for demanding to be seen as an individual and not part of the white group, and so on. So I think one of the things that people like Chris Rufo are highlighting, because there's a lot of those examples from corporate training programs and university departments and so on. Why are we still dividing people up by skin color if race is a social construction? Why can't we just quit talking about it? Just construct it out of our social lives entirely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not familiar with these examples. I mean, obviously, if there's something like this happening, that's a problem, right? So it could just be some misguided trainer who's doing something like that, right? So I'm not sure about how true those examples are, but if something like that's happening, it's a problem. But going to your question about if race is a social construction, why not just not talk about race? So the problem is that even though it's a social construction, it doesn't mean that's not real, right? It's something that we construct. It's really there. We have a definition of what it means to be Black in the country right now. We have some perceptions around it. And then people are impacted by those perceptions, right? When you're in that group, and then maybe you get treated a particular way. We could change that category. We might decide what we call Black today is, going to join the white category, and what we call, something else is going to join the Black category. So we can change that when we want. But as it stands right now, we have those categories. They're real, and people experience it. So having a conversation about race, I don't think the conversation is a problem. It's just the difference in experiences. But I think there are ways to have that conversation that are respectful, right, and acknowledge that people obviously are individuals, right, and people should be treated fairly, and their dignity respected, regardless of what form you're in. So I think that's absolutely right. But I don't think the problem is just having a conversation about race. It was just the ways that those conversations occurred, in the example that you mentioned.
It does get talked about a lot. My wife's from Germany, and of course they have their own issues there, but there's no black-white issues. They have, Jewish issues, or they've largely gotten past that. And I guess Turkish people came after the war to rebuild the country, and so there's some tensions there. But she was astonished by how much race is discussed in America. I mean, it's like on every news show, every talk show. It's just constantly. I don't think we're past the conversation yet. I mean, to me, I would like to live in a post-racial society where the least interesting thing about you is your skin color. Like, how much melanin do you have? Who cares? What difference does it make? And my friend Sam Harris used this example, like, how many blondes are at Google programming? Who cares? Who knows? Who cares? Skin color, hair color, what color their eyes are. Who cares? Right? But we're not there. And why not? Why can't we just, I don't know, stop talking about it and let's talk about other things? But I don't think we're there yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I don't think people are ready to be there yet. But in some idealized world, maybe at some point, race ends up being less of a relevant way of looking at the world. But for now, it's still relevant for a lot of people in their everyday life. Um, it's interesting. I don't think I mentioned this. I'm actually calling in from Sweden right now, um, which
You
is,
are? Oh my
you know,
God.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, it's a really interesting place to be having this conversation. But what's been interesting about being here, and I've kind of appreciated, is that, in Sweden, people come up to me and they speak Swedish, right? There's this assumption that I've somehow assimilated into Swedish culture, which I think is interesting because it's not like that in a lot of other parts of Europe, right? But their
Mm.
assumption going in is that everyone is kind of part of their society, which is interesting.
What are you doing there? That sounds great.
Yeah, I'm doing research similar to the research I did in South Africa. So again, looking at the policing of sex work and kind of gathering data and information right now.
Mm. Mm. Wow, interesting. Yeah, I think it was Sweden that did a study. Well, they're pretty liberal and about women's going into different fields. There's very fewer barriers there than America for women to go into STEM fields, for example, and yet they still have, I think, an even wider divide than we have in the United States. So one explanation is that it's not sexism or misogyny holding them back. It's just they're not as interested in certain fields and they're interested in other fields. So, like for example, there's more medical doctors now, more MDs given to women than men. And so nobody talks about, well, there must be discrimination against men. It's just people have different interests, right? And there's in that pipeline, there's just fewer women interested in going into, I don't know what, electrical engineering or quantum physics or something. There's just more men in it because of interest, nothing holding them back. So it'd be interesting if 50 years from now or 100 years from now, if we really got to that post-racial society and there were still group differences, we would look for other reasons for the group differences, like just interests.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think it's possible in that world.
Yeah. All right, let me just ask you one last question. I had two other guests, African American guests, Shelby Steele and Jason Hill on the show. Jason is pretty libertarian, kind of Ayn Rand objectivism. Shelby, as you know, is pretty conservative about this. Their the thoughts on this is, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Why depend on white people to help you? Don't depend on the government for handouts, that kind of thing. And, so to Shelby, I said, well, what if you're born without boots to pull yourself up by your bootstraps? And he's, well, you just make your own boots. Just come on, just do it. So I'll just read you a couple quotes here from Shelby Steele. We human beings never use race except as a means to power. Race is never an end. It was always a means, and it has no role in human affairs except as a corruption. America's original sin is not slavery. It is simply the use of race as a means to power. Whether for good or ill, race is a corruption, always. And it has always turned one group into the convenience of another group. And then he blames liberalism, right? In the 1960s, you probably know his arguments that it was the great sin was to steal responsibility for black problems away from black people, leaving them vulnerable to destructive social forces such as the drug epidemic of the 70s and 80s. It was the suffering of blacks that justified liberalism's demand for power, but this only relegates blacks to permanent victimhood and alienates them from the power to uplift themselves. Your thoughts?
Um, I don't agree. I think it's way more complicated than that. That there were structural factors that came in. I mean, around the 1960s or so, 70s. Some of the changes in social welfare programs, for example, actually helped discourage Black marriage, right? And so, where there were programs, if their people were married, they would no longer actually be able to apply for benefits. And so, around that same period, you have a lot of people who weren't getting married or who were concealing their marriages or and the like. So there, I think you actually need a policy that incentivizes marriage, for example, if you want um, you know to see that within a particular culture or society. Even with the war on drugs, it wasn't just something that innocently happened upon Black community, and Black people were just too weak to respond to it. We have evidence, especially now, from people in the Nixon administration as well as the Reagan administration. Some of the papers that were released by the children of people in that administration showed that actually there was a deliberate policy of targeting Black communities for drug enforcement and for some of the harms of the drug war, which was really interesting. And it was really candid admissions that we're going to use the drug war to kind of target Black people and kind of suppress some of what we're seeing during the civil rights era, which is, some of, for as a young Black woman, I would hear these types of conspiracies when I was in high school. Maybe someone's like uncle would say something like this, and you would think the person was like a little off and like, what are you talking about? It's, the war on drugs is just a government conspiracy. And so when these recordings came out, I think it was about like 2 or so, maybe it was up to 4 years now ago, it was pretty remarkable. Like, wow, this is, what that uncle was saying all those years ago, that there were in fact, government officials who liberally wanted to target the Black community with drugs. So, I think the idea that you just pull yourself by your bootstraps is kind of simplistic. It ignores, some of these other factors that we have evidence for. The fact that, there were these policies that were created that were meant to be disruptive of the Black community. And I guess the question of how do we deal with it, you need a more, I guess, multi-layered kind of approach. But it's not just enough for us to say and to reprimand individuals to fix themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe, and then Jason Hill's argument is, again, he's very Ayn Rand in this sense of just the individual is everything. I don't want to be treated as a member of a group. And he's an immigrant from Haiti. And, he's very successful, right? A couple degrees like you and so on. What's the problem? He says, look, I did it. You can do it. I came here with nothing. Right. So, but is that just, again, oversimplifying the individual versus on average, the collective group is not doing as well as that other group over there?
Yeah, I think that's simplistic. And, in some ways, I think it's easier for Black immigrants than for Black Americans. I think the benefit that you come with, sure, you don't come with, property or that sort of material with, but you are kind of liberated from some of the baggage from prior generations. First off, if you were immigrated into this country, that means that you have some sort of family or yourself who had the means to migrate to a new country, who had the aspirations and hope that you can have a better life in a foreign lands. That mindset and those means in and of themselves, I think, makes you more privileged than maybe many Black Americans, right? And so you're already starting from a more privileged position than from other people, right? And then the mindset, the ways that you're instilled with certain beliefs about yourself and about education, because you're free from the baggage of seeing multiple generations fail. You're free from the baggage of having a grandfather or great grandfather who was a slave, right? So one of the judges I clerked for, his grandparent was a slave. You're free from some of that baggage, right? Most of what you have is like the hope of America, and I think that's a lot, actually. Like your beliefs and your values. I think that's a huge benefit that Black immigrants in particular get that Black Americans don't have, given the history.
Right. So, final question: how do we fix all this? To what extent do you think reparations should be on the table as a legitimate part of the conversation? And if so, in what form? Just cut a check to everybody, or I don't know, home loans like the GI Bill after World War II, where we rewarded soldiers by giving them a free college education and cheap home loans and so forth. And if we do whatever we do, if we do that for African Americans, what about Native Americans?
Mhm. Yeah, I think for Native Americans, for African Americans, I think reparations should be on the table. What that looks like, I'm not I'm not really sure. I don't focus much on, that type of policy. Perhaps it's something that looks like the GI Bill. Perhaps it means, you know, looking into communities and ways to like rebuild or provide certain incentives to communities. I think there are a number of different ways. Maybe it's, starting off with the inquiry around, what would this look like? What would it mean to like repair and, address some of the past injustices and, really taking that seriously.
Yeah. Very good. Well, okay. Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for talking to me. And I'll let you get back to your work. I guess I don't know what you is it nighttime there? Are you going to a brothel late tonight? By the way, what are the laws in
It's
Sweden? Isn't
midnight.
Sweden super liberal about that sort of thing? Oh, it's
No,
midnight.
actually,
Isn't Sweden pretty?
yeah,
No, no.
it Sweden's interesting.
What?
It's liberal in some ways, but more morally conservative in a lot of ways too. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. You wouldn't.
Oh,
It's
I didn't know
not
that.
necessarily
Which
what
is
you hear in American media and culture. Yeah.
which is the country where they
So
legalize
no,
drugs and hand out, and they regulate the drug industry and they give out free needles. Is that Sweden? That was that Norway?
that's,
Or different country?
that's, maybe in Norway, I'm not sure. And Portugal for sure. That's one of the places. In Sweden, all drugs,
Oh,
even
right.
marijuana, are criminalized.
Really?
And
Oh my
they're
God.
pretty strict about that. Yes. Yes.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. Well, again, a lot. I think a lot of that racial disparity comes from the certain things being illegal, like drugs and the sex trade, and then targeting them, and then you're going to get those discriminatory practices. Just legalize it, for gosh sakes. Legalize it, regulate it, and tax it. The government can make money. Come on. All right, India. Thank you. It's midnight there. Thanks for staying up late for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.